Lynette Yaremboachi Fly in League with the Night has been many years in the making, and originally it was slated to open in May 2020. Of course, the world changed dramatically. It's amazing to have had the time in the galleries at Tate Britain to be with the work at this extraordinary moment in history. It really highlights just how important culture is, but also the power of painting. Lynette Yaremboachi is a London-based painter. She trained at Falmouth College of Art and then went on to do her master's at the Royal Academy Schools in London. She's an extraordinarily critically acclaimed artist. She's had exhibitions worldwide, but this is the first exhibition to survey her practice in full.
I really wanted it to be intuitive. I didn't want to hang it chronologically. It made more sense to me to think more in terms of making these dialogues and relationships between themes and ideas that have spanned and crossed over the years, things that have recurred, things that have a relationship to each other, that have a dialogue with each other. And it was a real luxury to be able to do that and have the freedom to decide to do that, not to be constrained by some kind of theme or chronology. And just to look at, visually, it just makes more sense somehow. I think it makes sense. Don't know about anyone else.
Obviously, the first room is incredibly important. You need to set the temperature, you need to set the mood. And it was fantastic making those decisions with Lynette. She has such a keen eye and such a sure sense of what works. The first room took us quite a while to figure out. But one thing was clear from the start, that we would have Black Allegiance to the Cunning as the first work that visitors see when they open the door. And it shows a man very relaxed on a kitchen chair, laughing and looking directly at the viewer. But then you see that underneath his chair, curled up, just as happy as the man on the chair, is a fox. A fox, of course, usually associated with wilderness. So this painting from the start gives you a jolt of something slightly surreal, and therefore sets the mood for the rest of the room and the rest of the exhibition in a way. To your right, in that first room, you have two paintings that are very dominant in their chromatic brilliance because they both use such strong reds. The one on the right is called First and is a painting from 2003, the earliest work in the exhibition. And it's from a phase where she painted figures in an almost cartoonish way, with sometimes a slightly grotesque underpinning and a humorous but maybe slightly sardonic twist. And next to him is any number of preoccupations from 2010, which portrays a figure wearing a very similar red robe, but sitting down and the robe is closed. And there is this extraordinary serenity and calmness in the expression of the sitter. What is interesting about these two works and what connects them is the inspiration for the red robe stems back to a painting by John Singer Sargent of Dr. Podsey, a very elegant gynecologist and collector and thinker. It's a pairing that took quite a long time to figure out, and Lynette suggested, let's put them next to each other. And the moment we did that, it clicked.
When I talk about them as not existing, I'm always trying to be really clear about the fact that it comes from a variety of sources. I have materials that I work from. No one can just pull it out of their head from nowhere. They're not of people that I know or that are there or that are specific, or they're built out of many different people or things or thoughts or images that I've found or images that I've drawn or in some part memory. But I always need materials to work from.
Lynette she's always been a figurative painter, and she's always been a figurative painter of a very particular kind. There is not much narrative detail in her paintings. They're very stripped back, very minimal, if you want. There's hardly any reference to time and space in which the figures are located. What she really concentrates on is the pose of the person and the facial expression. And it's much more about setting a mood and about revealing different layers of the mind.
Sometimes, as we see in this room, in 3 works, there's a hint of a domestic interior, a sofa or floor or a plate, a cup and saucer, something that situates that figure in a more intimate space that feels more private. But ultimately, there are no determining signifiers of any particular era or class or anything that might limit our interpretations of the work. And that's something extremely important. That ambiguity is strategic on behalf of the artist. And you'll see that happening throughout the works in the exhibition. Many of the works in this room have the same treatment. There's a tendency to focus, of course, on the figure because these figures feel so real. They're not, of course, they're fictitious, but they speak to us almost like characters in a novel, precisely because they don't really exist.
I took an interest in everything, really. Photography, drawing, painting, sculpture, and then somehow wound up focusing on the thing that I found the most difficult, which was painting. The difficulty I found with it meant that I kept going back to it. And I don't think you ever find it easy as such. I haven't. I still don't find it easy. I still don't ever feel like I've really got there. I don't think you ever really get there. Maybe that's part of the draw. You never really feel like you're doing it properly. So you never really stop learning.
In room 3, some of the largest paintings are in there. We have Wrist Action and Bound Over to Keep the Faith from 2012. The same man appears in these paintings. In each one, he's wearing a white top and black trousers. But what is most uncanny is this smile, turning back over his shoulder, directly looking at the viewer with gleaming teeth, but this smile has a somber and slightly menacing undertone. And that sense of unease that we get from these paintings is heightened even more by this strange pink glove or hand in wrist action. So very, very unsettling. And it's a character that Lynette has returned to. So this is the other fascinating fact for viewers to know, that even though all of these figures are invented and part of the artist's imagination, some of them return. Also, in the same room, 11 p.m. Tuesday, the very pensive man wearing a stripy t-shirt, there must be well over a dozen paintings that Lynette has made of a man wearing a stripy t-shirt. They act as a kind of starting point for Lynette, and often she says when she embarks on a new body of work, before she knows exactly the direction, she will return to the man in the stripy t-shirt, or even to the man in the white top, the slightly scary one, to just reset her compass. So it's a very interesting methodology for a painter.
During the first national lockdown in the UK, Yanin Bakshi was able to work from home. She wasn't able to travel to her studio where she tends to make the large-scale works, but what she was able to do is make an extraordinary body of work that's much more intimately scaled. And there's one particularly compelling work, a small figure titled Razor Bill, and it's a figure that's caught seemingly in the middle of singing or speaking. And this is one of the works that we were lucky enough to include that Yanin Bakshi made this year in 2020. It's wonderful to have it here in dialogue with work from previous years. There's something joyous, but also slightly unnerving about this painting. What is so wonderful about spending time with these paintings is the way that they engage us.
Given the restrictions that we were working under, I think we have achieved a high standard. I found that this became a kind of an adventure for all of us in terms of discovery. I've learned so much working through this process. I've also learned contemporary artists come with a different vision. Being able to plug into that vision, bringing my experience to meet their expectation. I think we've created something really, really special, really rewarding. And people say to me, this is proof that one exhibition is never the same as another. And I'm looking forward to the reaction from the public because I think it will be very positive.
Here in room 4, there's a different feel, a different atmosphere. The paintings are more densely hung, with very interesting connections between one another. What is really extraordinary about Yanin Bakshi's work is that everything is worked out and composed directly on the canvas. These are paintings that we see unfolding through time, almost. And that's why the relationship between individual paintings is so very compelling and interesting. And these are paintings that we can return to again and again, and we will look differently.
One of the works in this particular room is called Debut, and it's a man standing with one arm outstretched, who's kind of stepping forwards towards the viewer from the canvas. And this is a kind of pose which comes up quite often in her work, and you see it come up later on in the exhibition or from a slightly different angle in other places. And there's something kind of quite saintly about it. But the other characters in the room are doing all sorts of things. There's a group of 3 men smoking, none of them making eye contact with you, where in other rooms, like in the first room, the eyes of all of the paintings follow you around the room. In this room, there's maybe a bit more of a sense that the party is happening, but you're not necessarily invited. And there are conversations happening, again, between people within the canvases. There's one particular work in this room, The High Mind and Disrepute, which is a very new work. And in this work, where music is often implied, there will often be dancers or a suggestion of movement. In this new work, which hasn't been seen before, from 2020, there's a guitar and a man sort of singing to the other character in the painting. The titles of the work are really important, and there's, again, that ambiguity to them. There's definitely something going on. There isn't necessarily a narrative in the sense that there are, particular settings or it's obvious what's happening, but characters engage really intensely, both with each other if they're sharing a canvas, or across the room if it's a room where, that's the connection between characters. But narrative, I think, is implied, but it's a more nuanced, poetic approach to narrative than something that's immediately obvious. But I think that there's some generosity in that from her part that is completely open to interpretation.
Another large room that you will encounter is held together by the theme of landscape painting. Lynette had always wanted to show all her landscapes together in one space, so they're from all different periods.
From the beginning, I really didn't like the idea of wall texts, and I think part of that was something about this I wanted to be very much visual. I didn't want people stopping to read my intentions. There's something about allowing the work to speak for itself and allowing people the freedom to do that with the work, because I think there's an element of it that is so self-explanatory. And it's also allowed more space to actually put the work up and allow the work to be on the walls rather than essays.
At the centre of the exhibition, we are carried into the space by the most exquisite painting, a passion like no other. It's the painting which we chose to market the exhibition because it's such a wonderful, striking work. The first thing that really draws you in is the gaze. It's the eyes, it's the whites of this figure who's standing dead centre, dead on. He has a ruff around his neck, a little carnivalesque reference, perhaps. Otherwise, he's standing in a very deep, almost black blue. And he's situated in this totally abstract space of greens and blues and greys. It's a small canvas, but it commands our attention absolutely.
The Generosity is a painting which really, again, shows the speed at which it was painted. You can see the background is really, really quickly brushed in. You can see the drippy brushstrokes in the background, and they're applied very, very fast. the thing that I really like about this painting is the socks. And they're such a focal point and it's such a simple thing, but the way that very, very easily the brush has just been drawn down to show the texture of the socks in contrast to the broad brushstrokes in the background. It just makes it a very, very clever painting from a technical perspective. And overall it's got quite a matte texture, so paint medium being used without much oil and with quite a lot of diluent. And that's in contrast to the way the figures are painted, so the figures are built up with slightly thicker paint. It's economical in the way that she's applied the paint, but it's incredibly effective.
There is one small room in the exhibition that is the most, if you want, private and contemplative of them all. It has only a single entrance and exit, unlike the other rooms. And chromatically, all the works hanging in that room speak to each other. They are reduced colors of whites and off-whites and browns and blacks. So it's a kind of black and white room. And at the end of the room is the very powerful No Need of Speech from 2018 of two maybe dancers wearing these mysterious ruffs facing each other. The composition is so powerful within that very limited range and yet so mysterious. Another peculiar element of Lynette's work is that men and women never mix on her canvases. But A Fever of Lilies is a diptych of a man and a woman, and that's the closest they ever come. In most cases, there are one or two exceptions, but A Fever of Lilies shows a man and woman with a white top and dark shirt or trousers, and directly looking at the viewer, smiling. One of my absolute favorites of the exhibition is entitled For the Sake of Angels from 2018, and I saw it at the Carnegie Museum where Lynette had won the prize, the Carnegie Prize. And it's an extraordinary painting of a young man in profile with his shadow cast on the wall behind him. The modulation of the folds, the different variations of greys are so skillful and virtuosic and remind me very much of the many tabletop paintings by Cézanne. And altogether, these paintings exude such an extraordinary sense of serenity that you feel you're almost floating in that room.
The painting that carries us through the central gallery into room 7 is a particularly compelling painting. She is standing against a really glorious crimson red background, leaning almost out of the picture plane, as though to greet us. Not necessarily particularly welcomingly, but with absolute self-assurity. The combination of tones and the choice of colours here feels closely related to a painting that we know Yaron Boakye loves very much, which is Degas' La Coiffeur. And that painting shares not only the same choice of colours, it shares something of that painting's psychological charge.
There's a balance here where other rooms, characters are looking directly at you and addressing you, and then in other rooms, not really bothered about you. There's a real mixture in here of the way in which the characters are interacting with the viewer.
You can only ever really speak for yourself and speak to your own experience and from your own experience and from your own life, regardless of how old you are or where you're at somehow. And I think I've never been one for making grand claims in that sense. I'm very much working it out myself. But that's not to say I don't know what I'm doing. I mean, I may not have always been brave enough to admit it or explain it, but I know what I'm doing. I know who I am. I know where I am. I know right from wrong. I know what's wrong, somehow. And I think I've always felt like it's there's nothing really that I don't want to define myself with. I'm all of the things that I appear to be. I think it's just important that people understand that they never really know everything, and that there are so many components that go to making up a person's life, a person's way of seeing the world. Because essentially, the work has always been that. It's how I see things, and there is secret knowledge there. There would be, of course, there is, which also I don't feel the need to explain. Those who get it, get it. The people I'm speaking to, they know. They know. That's enough. I've never tried to do more than that.
Here in Room 8, there are a number of very striking group portraits. There's one in particular that greets you, and it's a painting of 4 men standing much too close for COVID times, but they seem thoughtful and they seem collegial. 3 men looking on as the central figure looks out to us. They're clearly talking, they're conferring. Something intimate and professional is happening. But precisely what is unclear. It's a very different painting to some that we've seen in previous galleries, but nevertheless one that speaks to this very human experience, and one that I think speaks to a general sense of shared humanity that Yaron Boyatzky's work very much addresses.
There's another work in this room called Citrine by the Ants, which is a very small work, and this is one of my favourite works in the exhibition. There's this flash of gold behind the character's head that kind of picks up the tie in another of the paintings. This character is really introspective, where there's maybe the implication of celebration or gathering. Citrine by the Ants is kind of on his own, thinking his own thoughts, and isn't necessarily engaging with the other characters in the room or with you necessarily. So that's another shift, that sometimes these characters are really just there for themselves.
One thing that's very special about the work, and that makes it so relevant for now, is the atmosphere, the mood in the paintings that connects them all, really. There's very little happening in the paintings. The characters, the figures in the paintings don't do very much. They're all at repose. They're relaxed. There's very minimal activity. There is overall a sense of tranquility, repose, of conviviality, also of joy. A lot of the figures in the paintings are laughing or smiling. Those smiles can sometimes be very ambiguous, but there is a sense of lightness. The work leaves the viewer with a slightly recalibrated frame of reference, a different relationship to time, because all references, direct references to a period or time, are removed. And it seems that each figure is the product of the artist thinking aloud in a very real way. But this tranquility and serenity is something that connects them all, and a real sense of, a strong sense of humanity, a sense of being in the world, and a sense of confidence that permeates probably all of the works.
The one that was hardest to hang was the Stygian silk, the one with the dogs, because it's so dark and because there's a lot of reflection coming off it. There are areas that are quite matte, and then other areas that are much more shiny. And that wall was actually the darkest, and even when lit, it doesn't feel as illuminated as the others. And it feels like there's a shadow casting on it from elsewhere. So it's just like the perfect position for it. I really enjoyed painting it because there was a certain constraint to it. There were certain constraints just in terms of the tone and the colour. I had to stick to a very particular palette. Also, I was limited by the fact that there is actually another painting underneath it. I worked over the top of something else and completely turned it into another painting, basically. And so I remember making it, and I remember it being a very taxing yet enjoyable time, because it was such a lot of calculation, such a lot of balance and logic and intuition, but also a little bit of science, and really having to think about all the different gradations of one colour, which is blue. Essentially, I think most of the painting is blue. I never use black. I never actually use a pure black paint. It's always a very, very dark shade of brown or a very dark shade of blue. It was one of those processes in a way that was just really satisfying on the mind, because there was a logic there, and that doesn't always happen.